It's been a while since we started a stream with some guitar. How's it going, everybody? Woo! We got a great stream plan today. We're going to be talking about World War II, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. We'll talk about Oliver Anthony a little bit. I just did another TikTok on it. I have to vent about this before we get into the show. I just got a comment from someone who I kind of know. Like, I've never, talked to them, but, we've been mutuals on TikTok. And, I made a video about Oliver Anthony's video where he says that he's not a Republican and, he wants things to change for the working class. And his song isn't explicitly political in terms of the two-party duopoly. It's just about the working class. And I made a video about that, and someone responded and said, why don't you listen to your peers and stop talking about Oliver Anthony, or not do this interview with Oliver Anthony, or condemn Oliver Anthony as bad and evil and no good? Like, my peers? You mean like people on TikTok who I've never met? I'm sorry, but that's not who I consider my peers to be. Right. And the less that I listen to leftists on Twitter and TikTok, the more Midwestern Marx seems to grow. The more I feel like I'm able to connect with actual working class Americans. And even people in my community, and different wrestlers who I know have told me they're extremely excited for the Oliver Anthony video. But I'm supposed to not interview Oliver Anthony and not talk to him about class struggle and the labor movement and the upcoming GM strikes, the auto worker strikes that are going to go on, and try and get him to support that because my peers on TikTok are mad about it? Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. Sorry to the people on TikTok. I love you. But the working class matters more to me than TikTok leftists. So today we're going to be talking about, as I said, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, though. We're going to be going into the real causes of World War II. I saw a really good video. Someone sent a good video in the Discord from Guerrilla History, I believe is the name of the podcast. It's not a podcast I'm super familiar with, but Guerrilla History, they were talking about the sort of myth of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the myth of a Soviet-Nazi alliance. And it reminded me of one of my favorite Parenti videos about World War II. So should have a good segment on that. We'll also talk about capitalism and sports a little bit. I want to start doing a segment every stream where we break down what's going on in the world of sports from a Marxist perspective. I think that would be really cool. I think that might appeal to a broad audience. So we'll see how it goes today. But yeah, I'm really excited for this stream. So let's play the intro and then get right into it.
injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
All right, before we get into it, make sure to smash that like button. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, or follow if you're watching on Twitch. Like if you're watching on Facebook. Helping or hitting the like button really helps boost us in the algorithm. So really appreciate that, especially, for people who want to support the project, support the Institute, but can't give super chats or become Patreon supporters or whatever. Liking and sharing the stream is also extremely helpful. Speaking of super chats, we already got one from Sebastian. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Says, let's go. Let's go indeed. I believe some of the videos that we're going to react to today are videos that Sebastian sent in the Midwestern Marx Discord, which if you want to join the Discord, patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. All you got to do is be a $1 Patreon supporter. You can join the Discord server for life. We'll never kick you out. Right now, Kyle Pettis is using our Discord to try and organize a brigade of people to go out to the auto worker strikes that are coming up. So really exciting stuff going on there. We also talk about theory. You can recommend videos that will then get reacted to on the stream. So yes, very cool. Was watching some videos by Taimur Rahman during my dinner, but a live stream by Midwestern Marx takes priority. Well, wow. Well, that's a big honor because he is a smart academic and a very well-read Marxist. So thank you. What's up, Ware Pilgrim? Glad to see the mods are in the chat. Appreciate you always. This is going to be a good stream today. Absolute banger of a tune. Absolutely. Oh, we got Parenti himself here today, which is perfect while we're listening to Parenti. So what I want to talk about today is World War II and the real causes of World War II versus the mythical sort of narrative that we often get in the West, which is this narrative that communism and Nazism are equally bad, and actually there was an alliance between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany. Right? Even though the Soviet Union dealt 80% of German casualties during World War II, even though the Soviet Union did the brunt of the fighting, even though the Soviet Union lost 27 million citizens in the fighting against the Nazis in World War II, Westerners and Americans and bourgeois propagandists will still say that because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because of this peace agreement that obviously didn't last between Germany and the Soviet Union, that means that Stalin and Hitler were buddies. Stalin and Hitler were allies. Germany and the Soviet Union were tight. They were like this before they went to war and killed millions of each other. But that's obviously not true. As we've said many times on the show, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was basically a way for Stalin and the Soviet Union to buy time, to try and push back the war further so they could build up their military capacity and build up their industry. And actually, the Soviet Union had plans to go into Germany and take out Hitler before he was able to rise to power, before he was able to stop World War II. But a lot of the Western powers weren't on board with that because they had too many business interests in Germany. They were making too much money in Germany. There were too many Ford plants in Germany, making money for Henry Ford and his corporation. So this myth that we get about the Soviet Union and Hitler being buddies is a Western dogma that they, the only evidence they have for it is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But some of the videos we're going to go into today are going to explain how ridiculous that myth is. So the first one I want to play is from Guerrilla History. This is a really cool Marxist podcast. I'm not sure who runs it. Brett O'Shea of Rev Left Radio might be part of it. I don't know. I know that they have some sort of connection to Rev Left Radio, but either way, they tweeted out this clip from their podcast. This is false, utilizing, and this is in response to Paul Massaro, who's one of the biggest anti-communist Ukraine simps on the internet. If he's not a Fed, I would be shocked. But they say, Paul Massaro said, 84 years since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Never forget that Russia and Germany started World War II together as allies. So Paul Massaro here repeating that exact myth that I just laid out for you, this myth that because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Russia and Germany were allies, even though, the world owes Russia a great debt because they did the brunt of the fighting against Germany in World War II. Idiot Fed Westerners like Paul Massaro will still try and portray Russia and Germany as if they were buddies, as if they were friends, as if socialism and fascism are the same thing. But nothing could be farther from the truth. And Guerrilla History responded, or this person responded with a clip from Guerrilla History saying, "This is false. Utilizing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a means to beat communists over the head is a commonly used canard by both liberals and conservatives. It disregards a lot of history, though." Yes, it does what bourgeois historians always do. It isolates something in history like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact while ignoring all the different factors, all the historical context, all the history that led up to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, all the history that followed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so that they can say the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the same. Full stop. Sorry, I had it muted.
Push back on the characterization of like Molotov-Ribbentrop. It would have been nice to push back and say, hey, there were previous attempts between the Soviet Union and Western Europe before that pact was signed, like April 16th, 1939. There was a direct proposal from the Soviet Union to have a military pact with France and the UK to directly oppose, Nazi Germany. This is 4 months before Molotov-Ribbentrop is signed. And that goes beyond, Western powers were also signing pacts with Nazi Germany at the time, Four Powers Pact, 1933. That was UK, France, Italy, and Germany. Anglo-German Naval Agreement, 1935, UK and Germany. German-British Non-Aggression Pact, 38. German-French Non-Aggression Pact, 38. There was a lot of these things, but it seems like that we dwell on Molotov-Ribbentrop, so that would have been something that I would have liked to push back on.
So very good there. It's Battle Cossack. Thank you so much for the super chat from Argentina. Appreciate you as always. But exactly what Battle Cossack said here is what they said in the podcast. The path was to buy time for the Soviet Union to build up their military capacity because Britain and France wouldn't join the USSR in the fight against the Nazis. They waited till the absolute last minute, until the Soviets were already, engaged in a brutal war with Germany. Thank you so much, Battle Cossack, for that super chat. I appreciate you. And I put the link to this tweet in the chat so you guys can go and boost it if you have an X account, if you have a Twitter account, because Paul Massaro is one of the biggest idiots and one of the biggest bourgeois propagandists on Twitter. He's constantly getting a lot of likes and attention for some of the dumbest, most brain-dead, foolish takes I've ever seen in my life. And he'll actually delete them if they're proven wrong, especially his takes about Ukraine. He'll say the most ridiculous stuff, make the most ridiculous predictions, and then when they don't come true, a month later, he'll delete them. So go boost this tweet so we can show people how much of a fool Paul Massaro is. But this little clip here reminded me of this talk from the man himself, Michael Parenti, about the real causes of World War II. This is one of my favorite Parenti clips of all time. And here he's going to go even more in depth than the Guerrilla History podcast did there.
Parenti for Real History, a series of talks by me about important and controversial themes in history, many of which have been buried or ignored by those who control our intellectual environment.
Battle Cossack with another super chat. Thank you, Battle Cossack. Really appreciate that. All of our funding at the Institute, the Midwestern Marx Institute, comes from the viewers. We have no exterior funding. We have no billionaires dumping money into our institute. So every dollar you guys give us is extremely helpful. So appreciate you. I would say HistoryTube is probably worse. At this point, there are literally accounts like Kings and Generals who have their scripts being written for them by people like Turgut Gambar, who's one of the main social media department heads at the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically a CIA cutout. He's writing the scripts for a lot of these animated history accounts that are pretending to teach objective history, but are actually teaching neoliberal history that's riddled with myths and selectively chosen facts that make the West look good, make the Soviet Union look bad. So I would say HistoryTube is worse at this point.
Those who control our vision of the past exercise a preeminent control over how we see the present and the future. The usual explanations for World War II are the following. Hitler was a maniac and bent on world conquest, and nothing could stop him. Second, the West tried to avoid war by appeasing him. Third, the Soviet Union entered into an unholy alliance with Hitler in the Hitler-Stalin Pact and collaborated and made possible for him to have his successes. I want to show that all three of these statements are misleading and in some respects downright false in their implications. Let's begin with the first one. Hitler could have been stopped. He was not unstoppable, and there were powerful forces in the German army itself that were ready to stop him. In 1930...
Has anyone seen the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise? That's actually a movie about one of these uprisings within the German armed forces that aimed to take Hitler out, but ultimately failed.
Hitler unilaterally scrapped the Versailles Peace Treaty that limited Germany to 7 divisions. He began a major mobilization of 21 divisions. He then told his generals he was going to move toward 36 divisions. His generals were stunned. 7 divisions was woefully inadequate, but this was a mobilization for another total war in Europe. In 1937, Hitler told his general staff that indeed he planned war against France, Poland, and Russia, and it would come sometimes within the next 6 years. In fact, it came within 2 years. Again, Hitler's generals were absolutely flabbergasted about this and really concerned. Another war, a total war against all of Europe, was one that would bring the inevitable defeat and destruction of Germany. Well, what happened was a concerted conspiracy was begun by the German general staff to kill Hitler and remove the Nazis from power. The Wehrmacht, the German army, would surround and move against the Nazi SS divisions. Key commanders would move their divisions in place and take over the Nazi elite forces. A special commando unit would be set up to storm Hitler's headquarters and kill him. The generals did not see how Germany could fight 2 million French, the entire Polish army, and the small but powerful Czechoslovakian army, not to mention the British, who would be joining in inevitably. To save Germany, they decided to move against Hitler, but they got no cooperation from the West. In 1936, Hitler violated the Versailles Peace Treaty by remilitarizing the Rhineland. England and France did nothing to stop him. Hitler said England and France would do nothing to stop. His generals said it was too risky to move into the Rhineland. England and France proved Hitler right. In 1938...
But I thought it was the Soviet Union who helped Hitler. I thought it was the Soviet Union who was buddy-buddy with Hitler. Now you're telling me that the French and the British could have stopped Hitler before he started World War II, but they didn't?
The generals were about to strike. Much of the German general staff was involved. They hated Adolf Hitler. They hated the way the Nazis had treated the German military staff. I counted about 60 or so senior officers who were eventually executed by the Nazis or arrested or died one way or the other when these plans were eventually exposed. So they were ready to move again, but Hitler annexed Austria, and the Western leaders did nothing, and the plans to do in Hitler had to be postponed. They were temporarily politically impossible because Hitler was triumphing so much. The Western allies gave him Austria on a platter. It was hard to convince people that Hitler was destroying Germany when in fact he seemed to be empowering Germany. Later that same year, in September 1938...
I mean, that makes perfect sense. If the West and the Western powers are just letting Hitler take more and more land and do more and more, and the generals who are saying, you know, you can't do this, France and the UK are going to intervene, are being proven wrong, it makes sense that empowered Hitler in Germany. Whereas if the French and the UK had intervened directly, if they had put a stop to what Hitler was doing or tried to, you know, back these generals who wanted to oust Hitler from power, it would have been very different. And it's so interesting that the West is so eager to coup governments that they don't like, to coup any government that goes against their economic interests. You know, just 20 years after this, the U.S. had no problem cooing Jacobo Arbenz when he wanted to redistribute United Fruit Company land to the people. They had no problem backing sectors of his military and Carlos Castillo Armas to oust him from power. But when it comes to literally Hitler, literally the leader of Nazi Germany, no, we can't do a coup to him. That would be undemocratic. Let's just let him keep doing whatever he wants until he almost destroys the world.
War loomed inevitably. It seemed inevitable again. A war that the German generals believed they could not win. Hitler was laying claim to the entire western industrial base of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland. It was time to act. To destroy Hitler or Germany would be destroyed, was the thinking among the German general staff. And by the way, not just with the German military, but with other elements in the Abwehr, which was the German secret intelligence, not the Nazi Gestapo, not the Nazi party, but the government group, and a number of other groups. There were people who felt that Hitler had to be stopped. They were themselves all pretty much conservatives, by the way. By mid-September, the conspirators believed they had the pistol cocked and ready, aimed at the head of state. All that was needed was the order to pull the trigger. The trigger pulling would be initiated by Hitler himself when he announced publicly his intention to seize Czechoslovakia by force. And the hammer would fly forward when the British and French handed down their decision to go to war over the principle of safeguarding the integrity of small nations. Beck believed this is what they would do. Beck was the German general who was in charge of the conspiracy. The Czechoslovakian people believed that the British and French would do the very same thing, you know? At that same time, Hitler ordered a panzer division with supporting infantry to parade through Berlin. The crowd stood sullenly and watched them pass. This is Mason's description, by the way. It's a very interesting point. He notes that the Fuhrer had hoped for enthusiasm. Watching the apathetic reaction from a chancellery window, he was disgusted. He turned away and he said to an adjutant, "I can't wage a war yet with people like this." In other words, the German people were not all that gung-ho about war. They had just had a bitter and terrible war just 17 years before, and they remember the hardships and the loss and whatever else. So Hitler did not have mass support for war, much outside his party. Well, the German generals were ready to move against Hitler if he struck against Czechoslovakia and led to an impossible war. But once again, British Prime Minister Chamberlain came to Hitler's rescue. The Czechs were ready to fight. The Soviet Union was ready to fight and said it would join Czechoslovakia in the war against Hitler. The
Soviet Union said they would join Czechoslovakia in the war against Hitler? But I thought the Soviet Union and Germany entered World War II as allies. That's what Paul Massaro just said on Twitter, this guy who pretends to be a political and historical expert. All these Western historical experts told me that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact means they were best friends. Right? But here, if we look at the actual history, it was the Soviet Union who was ready to step in at the earliest and put a stop to Hitler's march. And it was the Western powers who kept letting Hitler grow in power and influence and seize more and more and more territory. This is really interesting. Look at this from Unparalleled Dev. 1933, Pact of Four. 1934, Hitler-Pilsudsko Pact. 1935, Naval Pact. 1936, Anti-Comintern Pact. 1938, UK Non-Aggression Pact. 1938, France Non-Aggression Pact. 1939, Romania Economic Pact. Look at all these peace deals that were signed with Hitler before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by Western countries. But these liars like Paul Massaro, these lying bourgeois Western historians, just isolate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to say, look, the Soviet Union and Germany were best friends. When nothing could be further from the truth. When, as Parenti saying, the Soviet Union was ready to step in before any of the Western countries, and all of the Western countries had very similar pacts to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They were also trying to avoid another world war. So these people who isolate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in history to say that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were best friends are morons. They're either morons or they're purposefully lying to you by removing all of the historical context from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to just focus on this one event and demonize the Soviet Union. Selective history. I like your profile picture, by the way, Marcus.
Union made repeated overtures to Great Britain and France and Poland and Czechoslovakia for a joint military pact, security pact against Hitler, that if he attacked any one of them, he would be attacked by all of them. But the British and French refused to join such a pact. Instead, the British and French hurried to Munich and gave Hitler the Sudetenland. The German general plan was collapsed. There was going to be no threat of war. There was going to be no danger to Germany. There was going to be no reason to move against Hitler. The conspirators pulled back. Czechoslovakia was not even allowed to attend Munich. It was at the Munich conference that Chamberlain gave Hitler Czechoslovakia, and that was the beginning of the end of the peace. 5 months later, Hitler moved in and took all of Czechoslovakia. By the way, even after Munich, the Soviet Union offered to stand with Czechoslovakia, even offering to send troops and planes. The Soviets, however, were denied passage to Czechoslovakia by Poland. Poland was a right-wing military dictatorship. and Poland thereby did its small part in the digging of its own grave. Let's take the second explanation, that Great Britain and France appeased Hitler.
Reminds me of Poland today backing the Banderite Nazis in Ukraine every step of the way.
And this is what led to the war. They proved weak and had no backbone. Well, they were war-weary and they were unwilling to fight. They were willing to take peace at any price. That's really not quite true. They had been war-weary after World War I, and yet they proved themselves very willing to fight. Right after World War I, British and French and 12 other nations sent expeditionary forces to invade and fight in Soviet Russia, as it was still called then, to overthrow the Russian Revolution. So they were quite ready to fight if it was to fight communists. They were not ready to fight the fascists. They were reluctant to confront Germany even when it was weak and could have been stopped in 1935 when it had only about 7 or 10 divisions. They had wind that the German generals were wavering. They had wind that there was a very serious conspiracy afoot. The British intelligence heard from the Abwehr, the German Secret Service, secret intelligence. The Abwehr tried to feed London secret information on the Nazi buildup. Chamberlain was not interested. Chamberlain failed to respond to all overtures from the anti-Nazi Germans, even high-placed ones who commanded divisions of troops, even conservative ones. In other words, I believe Chamberlain was not an appeaser. He was an active collaborator of Adolf Hitler's.
So why doesn't Paul Massaro talk about that? Why don't these Western historians talk about that? Why don't they talk about Chamberlain collaborating with Hitler? Why don't they talk about the West handing Czechoslovakia over to Hitler? Well, because that makes the West look bad, because the truth makes the Western imperialist powers look bad, and it makes the Soviet Union look good. And these liars, these propagandists, these deceivers of the public like Paul Massaro want to do the opposite. They want to demonize the Soviet Union. They want to demonize Russia. They want to demonize communism. They want to demonize the millions of Soviet soldiers, the millions of our comrades who gave their lives defeating the Nazi menace, ridding the world of the plague that was Hitler and his Nazi party. They want to demonize them for that and make it seem like the West is the only reason that the Allied powers won World War II. And they want to make it seem like the Soviet Union was buddy-buddy with Hitler. So they choose the most selective facts possible to make their narrative, and their narrative is the complete opposite of what actually happened.
They actively encouraged Hitler's policy. On Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain himself threatened Czechoslovakia if the Czechs failed to accept Munich. He threatened to freeze their assets. He would deny them all materials if they decided to stand up alone against Germany. And he handed over all Czech assets in England to Adolf Hitler when Hitler took over all of Czechoslovakia. He engaged in the active participation and dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and handed it over to the Nazis on a platter. Chamberlain saw Hitler and Nazism as a bulwark against communism in Germany. And he saw Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism in Europe. With a few exceptions like Winston Churchill, Western leaders...
Why don't they talk about that? Why don't they talk about the fact that the liberal imperialists would rather have Nazism and fascism than communism? Right? We always hear that communist governments and fascist governments are the same. They're both totalitarian. We've heard that ever since Hannah Arendt wrote that garbage book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Why doesn't anyone ever talk about the connection between liberalism and fascism? Right? Because if you look at the actual history, it seems like fascism and communism are diametrically opposed. The Soviet Union was the country that did most of the fighting against the Nazis, whereas the liberal countries only entered the war at the last minute when they were forced to. So why don't we ever talk about the close relationship between liberalism and fascism? Or why don't we talk about the fact that fascism always appears when capitalism and liberalism is in decay? Why don't we talk about the fact that communism crushed fascism in Germany and in other places around the world? Well, because that doesn't fit the West's narrative. The West has to lie and claim that communism and fascism are both two sides of the same coin, two sides of this made-up concept called totalitarianism, and they were buddy-buddy because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And it's just a lie, dude. It's just an absolute myth. It's just ahistorical bullshit. And it's so disgusting, and Michael Parenti is such a hero for spending his entire life fighting against the frauds in his field. The Western bourgeois propagandists who call themselves historians, but are nothing but bourgeois reactionary ideologues and disgusting liars. People like Paul Massaro
were more concerned with the Bolshevik specter than with the fascist reality. They were uneasy about Hitler's emergent power, but they didn't look upon fascism with the same loathing and fear that they did communism. Unlike the communists, the fascists were not a threat to private enterprise. If anything, the fascists had crushed socialist organizations in Germany and Italy and had made these countries safer for private capital. Now, to be sure, Chamberlain and his associates were eager to avoid war. They didn't want war, but much of that eagerness arose not from some kind of pacifism, some commitment to peace, or peace at any price, but from a willingness to strike the kind of bargain with a Nazi leader that they would never dream of entering into with the Soviets. The British historian Geoffrey Barakoff argued, quote, Hitler's successes in foreign policy would do less to German rearmament, the deficiencies and limitations of which were known to competent military circles, than to the tacit alliance of powerful reactionary elements in England and France, which, although loath to see a reassertion of German equality, were still more unwilling to check it by military alliance with Soviet Russia, or to run the risk of social revolution in Germany as a result of Hitler's fall. In other words, I'm not saying that Chamberlain necessarily loved Hitler, although there were plenty of leaders in the West who did. There was all sorts of people in America. Henry Ford was an open Nazi admirer, and a number of other American plutocrats, and a number of people in England also. But Chamberlain's feeling was, if I had to choose between Nazism and Hitler, or the risk, even the risk of Soviet influence in Germany, then we will take Nazism. They could much better live with the reality, the horrible reality of fascism, than with the future imagined risk of socialism. Western leaders never really quite reconciled.
They would rather live with the reality of fascism than the imagined risk of socialism. So true. So true. They would support fascism every step of the way if it helped them prevent the potential of socialism. And people act like the U.S. supporting Nazis in Ukraine is something new. Like the U.S. hasn't been supporting far-right ethno-nationalist groups forever. What do you think the Contras in Nicaragua were? What do you think those far right-wing paramilitary death squads were? They were fascists. They were fascists. And the U.S. helped those fascists in Nicaragua sell crack cocaine and flooded majority black neighborhoods with crack cocaine here in the U.S. Got all the poor people in the U.S. and all the black potential revolutionaries hooked on crack in order to fund these fascist movements in Nicaragua to try and stop the Sandinistas from gaining power. They would rather support the fascists, the right-wing paramilitary death squads, than even risk the potential of having a socialist Nicaragua, rather than even give socialists the chance to gain a foothold in Nicaragua. They would support the reality of fascism over the potential of socialism any freaking day. That is such a good quote. But the Sandinistas still got that dub, though. Nice try, Reagan, you piece of shit.
Themselves to the existence of a socialist Russia. And they, at the same time, they did fear Germany's growing strength. So their strategy was to turn Hitler's aggression against the USSR. So it wasn't appeasement. Chamberlain went to Munich because he had a plan. And that plan was to give Hitler what he wanted and then send Hitler east to attack Bolshevik Russia. After all, Chamberlain and his party had just attacked Bolshevik Russia. Let's see, we're talking 1939. They had just been there just 18 years before, 1921, invading Russia and trying to stop the revolution. By the way, this was not an altogether unrealistic plan. Given the rabid anti-communism and anti-Sovietism professed by the Nazi leaders, they were quite ready, and they talked about moving east, you know. The commander-in-chief of the French armed forces, General Gamelin, wrote in his memoirs that one of the aims of the Anglo-French alliance was to bring about a clash between German and Soviet interests. Harry Truman had made that famous statement. We ought to let Hitler and Stalin fight each other until they totally exhaust each other and bleed each other white. Now, in Asia, the United States and Great Britain has had something of the same plan. They did very little to deter Japanese aggressions in Manchuria and China. And here, too, the anticipation was that the Japanese might move against the Soviet Union. And so they were willing to give them a free hand, just as they were willing to give Hitler a free hand in Central Europe, in Austria and Czechoslovakia. And by the way, this is exactly what happened. In 1938, the Japanese militarists entered an alliance with Germany and Italy. It was called the Anti-Comintern Pact. The Comintern was the Communist International, made up of International Association of Communist Parties, which were heavily under the influence and hegemony.
Wait, hold on. I thought the Soviet Union was best friends with Germany, though. Paul Massaro in the NED told me that the Soviet Union was best friends with the fascists. But you're telling me the fascists entered into an anti-Comintern pact? They entered into a pact that was explicitly anti-communist, an alliance against communism? Have these Western bourgeois historians been lying to me? No.
Of the Soviet Communist Party. The Anti-Comintern Pact, an alliance of three fascist nations, Japan, Germany, and Italy, and they vowed a joint struggle against world communism. The Japanese then attacked the Soviet Union that same year near the Outer Mongolia area, leading to a full-scale war that ended with Japan suffering 18,000 casualties and military defeat. During all this time, by the way, American corporations continued to expand their investments in German heavy industry, including arms productions.
And now we see why the Westerners didn't want to do anything about Germany. I mean, for one, it was a bulwark against communism. They wanted the fascists to fight their communist enemies in the Soviet Union. But they were also expanding their business interests in Germany, because even though people like to claim that fascist Germany was socialist, it absolutely wasn't. The term privatization was actually coined in Nazi Germany because they were taking all the state-owned industries and selling it off to different multinationals and different business interests. They were privatizing the country, which allowed people like Henry Ford to make a lot of money in Germany. So Western business interests didn't want to take out Hitler. Hitler was doing fine by them. He was allowing them to accumulate profits. He was taking industries that were owned by the government, owned by the state, and giving them away to private interests. Why would they have a problem with Germany? And during World War II, they actually they would use American manufacturing plants as bomb shelters because they knew that the U.S. would never bomb their own capital.
I'm talking about corporations like Ford Motor Company and General Motors. Now let's move to the third proposition, that the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the most talked about treaty in history. By the way, it's still regularly referred to in the U.S. media at every opportunity.
We'll play a little bit of part two here.
The devils about how Hitler and Stalin met and made this alliance. Munich, by the way, is never described as the Hitler-Chamberlain Pact or the Nazi-British Pact, which it was. It's always antiseptically called Munich. Well,
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? How they changed the name to try and make it seem like something different. Let's start calling it the Chamberlain Nazi Pact. The British Nazi Pact. I like that better than Munich.
It said the Soviet Union had made repeated overtures to conclude collective security pacts with the United States and Great Britain in order to contain both German and Japanese aggression. These overtures were repeatedly ignored or rebuffed, including the Soviet attempts to render armed assistance to Czechoslovakia. In time, Soviet leaders lost what little confidence they had had in the sincerity and ultimate purposes of the Western democracies. It was evident that had Hitler at this time struck directly at Russia, he would have encountered very little, if any, opposition from France or Britain. As the historian Foster A. Dulles notes, the American government and Great Britain and France had an attitude which was to do nothing to free the Soviet Union from its anxieties regarding Hitler's crusade against communism. If it were impossible to crush Nazi aggression by a united front, Stalin felt the next best thing for Russia was to attempt to divert any immediate German attack from the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1939, the Soviets made frantic efforts to enter into negotiations with Western leaders, French and British leaders. French and British sent a delegation by boat to Moscow, which took a week. When they arrived, they had no protocol papers. And the question came up is, where are your papers? Who do you represent? Can you negotiate with state authority? It became clear during that summer that a stall was underway. So what in fact happened is that Stalin began to make overtures with the Nazis. Isolated by the West, frustrated in its last-minute attempts to form.
So only after repeated efforts by the West to ally with Nazi Germany or turn Nazi Germany against the Soviets, and the Western powers repeatedly rejecting these efforts to take out Hitler before he launched World War II. Only after that did Stalin look to make a peace agreement. Did Stalin look to prevent his country from being invaded by the Nazi forces. And that is what the liars and bourgeois propagandists like Paul Massaro take out of context to say that Stalin and Hitler were best buddies. Do you see how absurd it is? Do you see how much of a myth this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact nonsense that we always hear is? You know, a myth that's been repeated by our old buddy Prax Ben on TikTok a million times. It's always saying Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as if it's an own, right? When you say that, anybody who knows the real history can automatically dismiss you as an idiot or a liar, right? If you believe that Hitler and Stalin were best buddies in the lead up to World War II, you either don't know what you're talking about or you're a propagandist and a liar. Because there were far more peace agreements between the Western powers and the Nazis before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was ever signed. And the Soviet Union was eager to do something about Hitler, but the West was not, because their business interests were making too much money in Germany and because they wanted to use the Nazis as a bulwark against communism. And at that point, Stalin attempted to stave off the war through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But let's just isolate it from its historical context. Let's just talk about this fact while disconnecting it from all the factors and the historical preconditions that allowed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or brought the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact into existence. That's how the liberal and bourgeois historians always do it. They always do it. And Marx talks about this in depth in the German ideology. He says they don't look at the preconditions and the historical factors that cause an event to exist. They isolate things from their historical context. They just take one event, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, isolate it from all its context and the things that happened after that, and use it to push whatever narrative they want. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler and Stalin were best friends. It's the mode of bourgeois history. This is how they interpret history, and this is how they're able to spin these myths and these stories and get the public to believe these myths that are nonsense, that have, Americans thinking that the Soviet Union and the Nazis were best friends when 27 million of our comrades from the Soviet Union died fighting Nazi Germany. And it's so disrespectful to it. It's so disgusting that these people like Paul Massaro and these Western historians spit on the memory and spit on the grave of the 27 million heroic Soviet citizens and soldiers who died fighting Nazi Germany by trying to say that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were best friends. No, the liberal imperialists tried being best friends with Hitler until they couldn't anymore. You liars.
An anti-Nazi alliance with Great Britain and France, and I would point out the Soviet Union was the only country in 1936, 7, and 8 that was the only major country that was trying to form an anti-Nazi alliance. And believing that it was being set up as a target for Hitler's aggression, and they believed correctly, the Soviets decided to sign an 11th-hour non-aggression treaty with Hitler in summer of 1939. To this day, the conservatives talk about this diabolic affinity between the Nazis and the communists for signing this pact. Conservative news columnist George Will would write, the 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact truly was a joining of kindred spirits. On another
Cobra says without the genius of Stalin, we'd all be speaking German right now. And yeah, people who follow the gaming stream, which, follow Midwestern Marks on Twitch and Eddie Lagersmith Gaming on YouTube if you want to be part of that. But some guy was like mocking us for supporting Stalin the other day, or acting like it was the most insane thing ever, which is what a lot of Americans do. But, and I get that we need to be practical and we're not going to win over American workers by holding up banners of Stalin, right? But there's truth and there's not truth, right? And the truth is that Stalin did everything he could to defeat Nazi Germany, and he was extremely successful in doing so. And without the industrialization policies of Joseph Stalin, and without the leadership of Joseph Stalin leading the first workers' state, the Nazis very well, it's very likely that the Nazis would have won, that they would have taken Russia, and that they would have, continued their expansion and tried to take over the entire world, or turn the rest of the European countries into basically colonies that they could super exploit. Right? So yeah, I'm going to defend Stalin against the lies of the bourgeoisie. The truth is the freaking truth. And I know it's not popular. I really don't care. There's facts and there's lies. And the bourgeois history and the bourgeois narratives and the bourgeois myths that we get all the time, that so much of our population believes, are terrible lies. It just is what it is. They've thrown so much crap and so many myths on Stalin's grave. When he wasn't a perfect leader, nobody's a perfect leader, but the world owes the dude a great debt of gratitude. And especially the 27 million Soviets who gave their lives fighting the Nazis. To act like they were just the same, that they were just the same as Hitler, get the hell out of here, you scumbags, you liars.
On another occasion, George Will described the Soviet Union as a regime that was, quote, once allied with Hitler. In fact, the Soviet Union was never...
We don't hold up banners of Stalin in public, just kiss posters in our bedroom before we go to bed. Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Allied with Nazi Germany. The pact was a treaty, but it wasn't an alliance. It no more indicated an alliance with Nazism than would a non-aggression treaty between the United States and the Soviets.
American popular culture has turned Stalin into a cartoon character. Parenti was my first introduction to the real Stalin. I won't lie, I was skeptical at first, but time has vindicated him. Yes, exactly. I was the same way. And this is, why I don't think that we should hold up banners of Stalin or the DPRK or whatever, because I understand people have been taught that he's an evil murderer and an evil monster. So it takes time to unpack these myths in people's heads and tell them the truth. But the more you study it, the more you read about it, the more you look at the Soviet archives or people who have written on the Soviet archives like Grover Furr, the more you hear from real historians like Michael Parenti, the more you realize that the bourgeois propagandists have been lying about Stalin. Then it makes sense. Of course they would lie about Stalin. He was the leader of the first worker state. He was the leader of the first socialist country. Of course they're going to pile a bunch of nonsense and lies on his grave. Right? I was the same way, especially with the DPRK when I first turned to socialism. I'm like, there's no way North Korea isn't an evil dictatorial hellhole where they torture their people and force their people into labor camps. But the more research you do, the more you're like, holy shit, I've been lied to about everything.
Indicate a U.S. alliance with communism. The pact was neither an alliance nor an agreement for the partition of Poland. Now, Munich had been a true alliance for partition. The British and the French dictated partition to the Czechs. They said, you obey, this is what's going to happen, and you better toe the line, and the Germans are taking you over. The Soviet government undertook no such action against the Poles. They merely promised to remain neutral, which is what the Poles had always asked them to do anyway. The Poles did not want to enter an alliance with the Soviets against the Germans. More than this, the agreement was, in the last resort, anti-German because it limited the German advance eastward in case of war. This is what Winston Churchill emphasized. With the pact, the Soviets hoped to ward off what they most dreaded, a united capitalist attack on Soviet Russia. And really, it was difficult to see what other course Soviet Russia could have followed. Ideally, they wanted the grand alliance with the West against the Nazis. But barring that, they turned the tables and made a pact with Hitler. When Hitler attacked Poland, the Soviets moved into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic territories that had been taken from them by Germany, Britain, and Poland in 1919. They overthrew the right-wing dictatorships that were in those countries. By the way, today we ought to remember when we hear about Lithuania going back to its democracy, that Lithuania wasn't a democracy. They were right-wing dictatorships that the Western counter-revolutionaries had installed in the Baltic states. The three states were incorporated as three republics into the USSR. The Soviets also took back Western Belarus, the Western Ukraine, and other areas seized from them and incorporated into the Polish right-wing dictatorship in 1921 under the Treaty of Riga. This has been portrayed as proof that they colluded with the Nazis to gobble up Poland, but the Soviets reoccupied only the area that had been taken from them 20 years before. History offers few, if any, examples of a nation refusing the opportunity to regain territory that had been seized from it. In any case, by reclaiming their old boundaries, the Soviets did draw a line on the Nazi advance. Even after Hitler attacked Poland, and Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, the Western collaboration did not end. And this is a part of the history that's not known, never mentioned by George Will, never mentioned by commentators today, and not mentioned by many historians either. When Hitler struck east into Poland, nothing happened on the Western Front. Now, don't forget, Great Britain and France had just declared war. there were still feelers from London and Paris about making a separate peace with Hitler so that he could concentrate on Soviet Russia. From September 1939, when World War II began, to May of 1940, about 8 months, there was no fighting between Germany and the Western Allies, even though they were at war with each other. The French began to call it la guerre drôle, the funny war, or the droll war, or the lazy war, whatever you want to call it. Others called it the Sitzkrieg, instead of the Blitzkrieg, it was a Sitzkrieg, a sit-down war. In England and France, it was called the phony war. There was very little fighting. Now, Hitler had every intention of taking on the USSR. That was going to be his final big fight. He wanted the breadbasket of the Ukraine. He wanted the oil fields of Baku. He wanted to destroy the communists. But he had to widen his base before attacking the Soviet Union. And so he took Denmark and Norway. He invaded them in April of 1940. That gave him more resources, more food, more farmlands, more factories, more conscript labor. Even then, high-placed conspirators in the German general staff made overtures to Great Britain for coordination of efforts. General Oster, Colonel Sass, General Beck, and even Field Marshal Rommel later on.
So Germany was already taking territories, right? They were already expanding and conquering entire countries in Europe. And the Western powers still wouldn't intervene. They still wouldn't do anything about it. As the Soviet Union was preparing their forces for war and lining up in military positions so that they could strike back against the Nazis.
Warned the British of Hitler's forthcoming, quote, violent, brutal offensive in the West. The British didn't take it serious. The British understood that there was an understanding with the Germans, and they were giving them all this European real estate, and they were finally going to move east and knock off the Communist menace. If the British would only guarantee the plotters, the Germans said, a fair peace, they would go at Hitler and overthrow his Nazi regime. The new government would relinquish Czechoslovakia and Poland and everything else except Austria. That was their first offer. London did not even take the offer seriously. In May of 1940, Hitler struck west. He wiped out France and much of the British army at Dunkirk. Then he attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin had expected it sooner or later. In 1939, Stalin had said, we have 10 years. In 10 years, we have to do what Britain did in 100 years. And there came the forced industrialization, as Soviet Russia built a whole new industrial base east of the Urals, an industrial base which eventually outproduced Hitler in tanks, planes, and artillery. 80% of the German casualties were on the Eastern Front. The scale and ferocity of the fighting was unparalleled.
80%. 80% of German casualties inflicted by the Soviet Union. It's crazy that that's a real statistic, and these people still try to lie to us and tell us that, you know, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were best buddies. When 80% of German casualties were inflicted by the Soviet Union, who lost 27 million people in the fighting. Like, how does anyone buy into this freaking lie?
Paralleled in the West or in any modern warfare ever. There was nothing in the Western Front that could compare to the Battle of Stalingrad, involving millions of troops. The Battle of Leningrad, where 2.5 million Soviets died. The Battle of Kursk, involving tens of thousands of tanks. The Battle of Warsaw, which took 2 months. The Battle of Berlin, where 3 million Soviet troops were arrayed against 1.5 million German troops, with almost 1 million casualties by both sides. Most discussions in the West about World War II focus on the Western War, which is about 1/5 of the actual war, and ignore the scale and horror and heroism of the Eastern Front. Most discussions in the West about the eve of World War II give us the usual blather about the Hitler-Stalin pact and say little about the active collaboration of the right-wing Tory government, about the Hitler-Chamberlain pact. Just as little today is said about the active collaboration of a right-wing U.S. government with fascists throughout the Third World and with Nazis in the Republican Party and in Bush's own campaign.
Just like they don't like to talk about the West collaboration with fascists today. But the West has always loved the fascists when it's convenient for us. They've always loved the Banderites, the Contras, the folks like the Azov Battalion, and even Hitler himself, as long as the fascists are fighting communists or enemies of the U.S.
The fascists are okay because they defend private property and corporate investments. It's the communists that are the menace, according to those who own the world. Those of us who want democracy might want to think about this a little more seriously. This is Michael Parenti for Some Real History.
Man.
That was
Bourgeois historians destroyed by Parenti again. Do you see why that's one of my favorite lectures? Why that's one of my favorite talks that Parenti's ever given? Because it blows apart this common myth that you hear all the time. You hear this myth all the time, dude. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. World War II nerds in the West won't shut up about it. Why won't they shut up about it? Well, because it's the only piece of evidence that they can take to try and make it seem like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were buddies. Right? If you looked at any of the other evidence, if you looked at the pact between Hitler and Chamberlain, if you looked at who did the majority of the fighting in World War II, if you looked at the efforts of the Soviet Union to take out Hitler before he launched World War II, it blows apart this nonsensical narrative that communism and fascism are the same, or that they were buddies at the time. It doesn't help the narrative of the liberals. It doesn't help the narrative of people like Paul Massaro, who are trying to convince you that fascism is preferable to communism. And then look at what's going on today. Look at what's going on today in Ukraine. You have the West backing folks like the Azov Battalion and Right Sector and all these Ukrainian fascists to use in a proxy war against Russia, and they're trying to convince you that Russia's the evil one. Putin's the evil one. Not to say Russia is still communist or still socialist today. They are not. But they are going against the U.S.'s economic interests. They are going against the interests of multinational capital and Western capital and Western finance capital. So, as Parenti said, the U.S. will support fascism in reality versus the potential of socialism. If they feel like there's a potential of Russia moving towards socialism or moving closer to China or moving away from the U.S. dominated economic model or the economic model dominated by Western finance capital, they'll back fascists all day, every step of the way. They don't care. They don't care who they're backing. I mean, time and time again, the U.S. empire has made bedfellows with the most horrific right-wing extremist groups, the most murderous paramilitaries and military groups in the world throughout history. Anything to protect private property, anything to protect Western finance capital. Pinochet, anyone? Exactly. They'll back a guy who murders thousands of communists in his country's national soccer stadium before they let a democratic socialist even get elected in Chile. Salvador Allende ran for election. It wasn't even a revolution. It wasn't even a seizure of power. Allende had run in the 2 elections previous, and due to U.S. involvement and U.S. meddling, he didn't win. And then when he finally came to power, the U.S. started backing the most horrific, murderous fascists imaginable in the Pinochet dictatorship, who would fly communists up in helicopters and push them out the window to their death. Because, as Parenti says, the reality of fascism is preferable to the potential of socialism for these monsters. So, the next time somebody brings up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to you and tries to tell you that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the same, you show them that lecture by Parenti. And if they still hold the position that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the same, they're probably a propagandist and a liar. All right, I didn't expect that to take a whole hour. I think YouTube really doesn't want me to ask a question because super chats will not work for me. Dude, someone else said that earlier. I wonder if YouTube is preventing people from sending super chats right now. That is annoying. That sucks for me. Or it sucks for Midwestern Marks. I guess you guys are going to get to save some money today, but that's so odd. I know you don't get to ask a question, but here's our Patreon. If you're looking to support the project financially, you can do it through there. You can do it through Buy Me a Coffee /Eddie Liger. Pull up a link here quick. How do I do this? Here it is. You can do it through there. Oh, it worked for Sam. I don't know why it's not working for some people. There must be some kind of glitch with YouTube. Thank you so much, Sam, for the $5 super chat. Appreciate that. Round of applause. Thank you, Sam, for performing this very expensive test. I appreciate you. Yeah, so apparently it's working for some people, but that's the question I was trying to super chat. The app crashes every time I try to send one, then it won't open again. Weird. Hey, Eddie, I'm reading Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State right now. Nice. That's one of my favorite books. I've led book clubs on that book. I've also started a reading guide for it. I haven't finished it. I need to get around to finishing that. But I have the first 2 or 3 chapters up as a reading guide on our YouTube if you find that to be helpful. One of my favorite books of all time. One of the books that helped me understand the historical materialist or dialectical materialist worldview. It's Engels applying the dialectical materialist method to prehistory and anthropology and the development of human society since the very beginning, as far back as anthropological evidence will give us. And a lot of the predictions that he made in Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State have been confirmed by modern anthropological research. It's very, very cool. That would be so epic. Definitely will watch after finish with the book. Definitely. Yeah, check it out. Like I said, it's chapter by chapter. So if you want to check out my chapter 1 guide after you finish chapter 1 of the book, you can do it that way. Or you can just watch the guide after you finish the whole book, whatever you want to do. Hegel, Marx, and Engels really broke ground. Absolutely among the great geniuses of the last 200 years. Absolutely, yeah. The predictions that Marx made in economics using dialectical materialism, the analyses and predictions that Engels made in science and made in the field of anthropology are truly incredible. Truly, truly, truly ahead of their time. Way ahead of their time. So, yeah, they really broke ground and are quite the geniuses. What should we watch now? Let's watch this. Mitt Romney recently admitted that the Ukraine war is a proxy war. So I don't know anyone at this point who argues against the war in Ukraine being a NATO proxy war.
And I'm out.
At the beginning of this conflict, there were TikTokers like Ryan Beard or Good Morning Bad News. Have any of you seen Good Morning Bad News? Or like, Good Morning Bad News, and then they give some news story. Him and Ryan Beard attacked me for saying that, or came after me, criticized me for saying that the war in Ukraine is a NATO proxy war. Here's Ryan Beard. He has 640,000 subscribers on YouTube. This guy said that I'm being a Putin simp, you know, because I was saying that it's a NATO proxy war and standing up against the NATO proxy war. So even guys like this, even libs like this who have no idea what the hell they're talking about, but want to attack people who are telling the truth and doing real journalism, even they, I think at this point, have to admit that it's a proxy war, right? There's like nobody, there are literally like U.S. State Department, Pentagon officials saying that it's a proxy war. But here, Mitt Romney basically admits it and admits what the goal of the war is in an extremely disgusting way. This is from Max Blumenthal.
Being able to take an amount which equals what, about 5% of our military budget?
Oh, come on.
But actually less than 5% of our military budget each year to help the Ukrainians is about the best national defense spending I think we've ever done. We're losing no lives in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are fighting heroically against Russia that has 1,500 nuclear weapons aimed at us. It's like, so we are...
It's the best spending we've ever done because we're losing no lives and those Ukrainians are fighting to the death. Really, really, Mitt. So this is the best spending ever because no Americans have to die but we can still attack one of our enemies. We can still attack Russia. And yeah, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of Ukrainians are being killed, being pushed to their death. But who gives a shit about them? They're just a proxy, right? We don't care about Ukrainians. We only care about Americans, apparently, according to Mitt. I've never seen such a blatant admission that we're literally using the Ukrainian people as proxies to fight against Russia, to fight against an enemy of NATO. And he's cheering it on. Yeah, we should spend more. You know, who cares about the thousands of Ukrainians who are being pushed to their death by NATO? Who cares? Just insanity.
We're diminishing and devastating the Russian military for a very small amount of money relative to what we spend in the rest of defense. A weakened Russia is a good thing, and the best thing we can do for America is to see people who have nuclear weapons aimed at us getting weaker. Being able to take...
So there you have it. That's why they support the conflict. Because we're weakening Russia while using Ukraine as a proxy. Who cares about the thousands of lives that are going to be lost? Right? And this is why, Ryan Beard and all you TikTok liberals, this is why you shouldn't speak about things that you have no understanding of. Right? This is why you shouldn't speak about global conflicts when you haven't done your research, when you have no idea what the hell you're talking about. Because you, Ryan Beard, have been cheering on a proxy war. You've been cheering on exactly what NATO wants you to be cheering on. You're calling yourself a supporter of Ukraine when you're cheering on Ukrainians being pushed to their death at gunpoint by NATO. You're cheering on the death of more and more Ukrainians, the destruction of more and more Ukrainian land, because that's what's going to happen the longer this NATO proxy war plays out. And we know that the U.S. has been the number one obstacle to peace. We know that the U.S. has been doing everything they can to break up a peace agreement. We know that they've continued to exacerbate the conflict by dumping billions and billions of dollars in weapons into Ukraine. And you hear Mitt Romney telling you why. Because it helps weaken Russia and it allows us to use Ukrainians as a proxy so we don't have to send American troops. They're literally telling you straight up that this is a proxy war. But these people still want to bury their heads in the sand and put a Ukraine flag in their bio and pretend they're a good person. And attack people like me who are actually telling the truth, who have actually researched this situation and aren't too cowardly to tell the truth about it, like you were, Ryan. You want to attack people like me for being a Putin puppet. Disgusting. You're doing the propaganda and work of people like Mitt Romney for him. And I'm upset about that because Ryan used to be my mutual. He used to pretend to be my friend. And then he calls me a Putin puppet. And I made like 4 or 5 videos saying, hey, Ryan, let's discuss this. Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. Let's have a conversation. You can explain to me why you think I'm a Putin puppet, and I'll explain to you why I think it's a NATO proxy war. No response. No response. He didn't actually want to have that conversation. He just wanted to call me a Putin puppet so he could get a pat on the back from his liberal buddies and move on. Well, guess what, buddy? You're a NATO puppet. Check out the video I suggested in Discord. It's Parenti on fascism. Okay, I'll check that out at some point. We'll throw it in the stream reaction links. Ching, ching, walla, bing, bang. Ryan is actually cool. It's sad he wouldn't. Yeah, that's what pisses me off about it, because Ryan and I used to be cool. Because I thought he made good videos. And then he made this post saying I used to like Eddie until he became a Putin puppet. And he didn't know what the hell he was talking about. He threw me under the bus so he could get a pat on the back from his liberal buddies. So I don't have that much respect for him when he's cheering on the deaths of more and more Ukrainian people. Cheering on this proxy war while he makes his YouTube and TikTok videos from the safety of the U.S. It's gross. Nice. Coincidence? I am reading Parenti's books right now. Hell yeah. I have so many Parenti books on my shelf, and they're my favorite ones to read. Got Black Shirts and Reds, of course, The Assassination of Caesar, Inventing Reality. There's more, too. To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia. That's an important one right now. That's one of Parenti's most overlooked books. That's really important right now because a lot of people still think that the NATO invasion of Yugoslavia or the NATO carpet bombing of Serbia was justified because people like Slavoj Žižek and people like Vauš talk about how it was a justified and moral intervention. But it was not. It was an intervention based on lies. It was an intervention where the U.S. was backing extremist and terrorist groups and trying to keep the country in a state of civil war, where they carpet bombed the country's infrastructure, their power plants, their farms, their water supplies. And now Kosovo, which was created after the conflict with the help of the U.S. and NATO, has more NATO troops there than any other place on earth. Right. So when Russia says that NATO has been continually expanding towards our borders, that's what they're talking about. Like when NATO literally dismantled Yugoslavia and occupied Kosovo, that was an extremely aggressive move that brought NATO much, much closer to Russia's borders. And that was 1999, which is 9 years after the U.S. promised that they would stop expanding NATO, because they said NATO was just a way to guard against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been gone for 9 years, and you have NATO destroying this country, carpet bombing this country, and moving closer to Russia's borders, which they promised not to do. Right? So to understand the proxy war in Ukraine today, it's important to understand the intervention that was led against Yugoslavia, which allowed NATO to occupy the region and move themselves closer to Russia. My favorite Parenti book to this day is called Land of Idols. It came in 1994, almost 30 years ago. I haven't read that one. I've heard of it. Very interesting. The early leaders of NATO were fascistic. I'm reading Inventing Reality. That one's the best. That book is so good. People like to talk about manufacturing consent. Whatever. Manufacturing consent's fine. Chomsky's fine. It's a good book. It'll help you understand how the media lies to us. Inventing Reality is a great book. Inventing Reality is just a better version of manufacturing consent. It's just what it is. And Parenti's got that Marxist-Leninist perspective as compared to Chomsky's anarchist perspective, and it's just superior. Although, who wrote Manufacturing Consent with Chomsky? I really like that guy. He's written some really good stuff about Yugoslavia, actually. Edward Herman. Yeah, Edward S. Herman. He's written some good things about Milosevic and Yugoslavia that really go against the grain and go against the common narratives and criticize NATO. My library has a copy of Parenti's first book. I really need to check it out sometime. Definitely. What book is that, Jimmy? That'd be awesome. I want to read all of his books at some point. That should be my new goal, to read all of the Parenti books by like the end of 2024 or something. That would be sweet. The Assassination of Caesar is really interesting because it's a class analysis of ancient Rome, which you don't get a lot of the time, like a Marxist class analysis, which, you know, the dialectical materialist worldview says that the history of all hitherto existing societies are the history of class struggle. So that doesn't just mean capitalism or feudalism or, you know, even slave-based economies. It means all of them, right? All history is driven by struggles between different economic classes. And ancient Rome was no different, which is what Parenti lays out in that book. And he says what brought Caesar to power was basically a populist uprising, an uprising of the people who were exploited and didn't like the aristocracy, didn't like the ruling class. So they got behind Caesar, who was promising to give economic incentives or economic benefits or better the material conditions of the working masses. Ooh, another super chat. Let's go. The anti-communist impulse. Oh, that sounds cool. The war showed how a lot of social democrats have a desperate need to seem like the reasonable lefties, to liberals beyond needing to find the truth. Absolutely. Yes, that's exactly what Good Morning Bad News and Ryan Beard were doing when they attacked me as a Putin puppet. Right? They were trying to portray themselves as the reasonable lefties. Right? Eddie's against this NATO conflict because he's a Putin puppet, but I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm a centrist, or, you know, I'm a more rational, or I'm not a centrist, I'm on the left, but I'm more rational. Right? I support NATO proxy wars, or at least tacitly support them. That's exactly what it is. It's just trying to appeal to the mainstream narrative. People are afraid to say things with their chest. They're afraid to go against the mainstream liberal narrative. They're afraid to actually look for the truth, actually seek the truth beyond the surface level propaganda that we're spoon-fed every day. And they're more worried about, you know, looking good in their liberal social group or their online social group, or in the case of someone like Ryan Beard, maintaining their audience as a content creator online, than they are with getting to the truth, telling the truth, and sharing the truth. Which I know he's not a political creator, but if you're going to comment on political things, if you're going to call me a Putin puppet, you should know what the hell you're talking about, dude. But like you said, it was less about knowing the truth in that case and more about him making himself seem like a good guy to the liberals who hate communists like us. All right, I want to do something new every stream. I want to start bringing up sports analysis and the way that capitalism.
Stephen A. Smith exposed how capitalism
I accidentally
has
played the video. I want to talk about the way that capitalism has infected sports, because I love sports so much. I follow so many sports, watch so many sports. So it's something that I'm already researching, or, you know, that I'm already able to talk about. It's not something that I need to do a lot of extra work to talk about. And I think it would be interesting to talk about sports because it has mass appeal. Who doesn't love sports, right? Humans are inherently competitive, right? Just kidding. But I do think humans are inherently competitive in a way. I don't think that means capitalism is the only system that could work, because it forces us to compete with each other. But I do think that we need competitive outlets like sports. But anyways, there's all these different ways that capitalism and consumerism have infected the world of sports and different sports. There's all these different ways that sports have been adapted to serve the neoliberal order. So, I mean, just look at the Super Bowl this year. Not only all the commercials, not only all the advertising and the consumerism that's pushed, but as they were flying like U.S. military jets over the stadium, one of the coaches, Nick Sirianni, was crying as Chris Stapleton sings the national anthem. Like, oh, I love the troops so much. It was just like a big-ass commercial for U.S. imperialism, a big-ass commercial for the U.S. military. So there's all these different ways that sports have been co-opted by neoliberalism. And I want to start talking about that at least once per show. So here's the video that we got today. I believe this was sent to us by Sebastian. This is Stephen A. Smith, extremely popular ESPN sports commentator, talking about how capitalism destroys sports journalism.
Stephen A. Smith exposed how capitalism has ruined sports journalism. Now, those are not his words. Those are my words. And I know Stephen A.'s political beliefs. He's not anti-capitalist. But he went on Paul George's podcast and gave a perfect breakdown about how capitalism ruins sports journalism. And so him and Paul George are talking about the antagonistic relationship that players and media can have. And Stephen A. is like, listen, you got to consider from the reporter's POV about why this happens.
But there's a flip side to it that you might not have considered.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that if a reporter walks up, let's say, for example, Paul George is, yo, man, I think I'm worth $50 million. I want this contract. And then you struggling. Do you know that if that reporter goes up to you and doesn't ask you about that, the editor's like, come here. Why do I have you on the beat? You going home. You got to understand that everybody has a job to do. a lot of times, particularly if it's a beat writer and it's somebody that's in their locker room after every game and is talking, is cultivating a relationship with you, they know you. So the last thing they want to do is come up to you and ask you that question. They have no choice because their job is on the line. And no matter how bad your game was that day, your contract guaranteed. And it's for a gazillion times more than that journalist made. You know, you got cat.
And so what he's talking about here is because of capitalism. In a capitalistic country like the United States, the penalty for not having a job is death. Not immediately, but if you don't have a job, you're not going to have shelter, you're not going to have healthcare, you're not going to have food, you're not going to have water. Nothing is guaranteed to you. And so that means if you're a sports reporter making $30K a year, you don't have any autonomy. You just do whatever your boss tells you to do. Because if you don't, you lose that job. And you're playing with life or death stakes. And so
this is a huge thing in mixed martial arts. Anybody who follows the UFC, whether you're anti-capitalist, pro-capitalist, whatever political ideology, everybody knows that you don't get access to UFC events. You don't get access to UFC press conferences unless you kiss Dana White's ass, unless you kiss the UFC's ass. If you ask one tough question of Dana White, if you ask him about fighter pay or something like that, your press credentials are revoked like that with the snap of a finger. Ariel Helwani is one of the most popular journalists in all of mixed martial arts, but he doesn't have access to UFC events anymore because he was too critical of Dana White and he was too critical of the UFC for not paying their fighters and giving them health care and stuff like that. Right? So all of the journalists who are left to ask questions are just the biggest simps for the UFC. All they do is brown nose the UFC and Dana White. If they don't even ask questions that are even slightly controversial. And if they do, Dana White freaks out at them like a man-child. Right? But what other option do they have? Under capitalism, that's how these people make their money. That's their livelihood. What are sports journalists supposed to do except brown-nose the league?
This is why sports reporting has devolved into, did LeBron James celebrate Taco Tuesday? Click the link to find out. The majority of basketball coverage is not about basketball. And even when it is about basketball, it's just mindless stuff like this. Start, bench, cut. Start, bench, cut. Start, bench, cut. Or it'll be, who's the GOAT? Has anyone thought about this? And so it gets to a point where talking about basketball isn't even fun anymore. And so we've established reporters have to ask players stupid questions because they're being told to by their bosses. And so why do their bosses tell them to do that? The answer is also capitalism. The bosses are also afraid of losing their jobs. And so in order to keep their jobs, they have to make sure the company makes as much money as possible. And in today's sports journalism economy, clicks are what makes money. And so you know what gets clicks?
Clicks are what makes money, and access journalism is what makes money. So this is a very similar thing that happens with political journalists. They can't ask tough questions of Biden, Pelosi, AOC, the rest of them, because then Biden, Pelosi, and AOC won't give them press credentials. They'll revoke their press credentials. They'll revoke their access. They won't talk to them anymore. Versus the journalists who are willing to write fluff pieces about them, they'll talk to them all day long, right? And these news outlets rely on clicks, and they get clicks through access, what's called access journalism, by having access to these politicians. Look, we got this interview with AOC. We got this exclusive interview with Joe Biden. We sat down at a press conference with the White House press secretary and heard what they had to say and reported on it, right? They need access to get these clicks. Same thing with sports, right? The UFC journalists, the best thing that they can do to make money from MMA journalism is interview the fighters. Get an interview with Dana White. But if you're critical of the UFC, if you say that, hey, these people who are fighting in a cage for our entertainment deserve health care, especially when the UFC is making billions and billions and billions of dollars off their labor, you get your press credentials revoked. No more access journalism. Good luck getting clicks now.
LeBron celebrates Taco Tuesday. Start, bench, cut. Is Jalen Green gay? And so let's say you have to write a story about Luka and Kyrie's partnership. You can go to your boss and be like, here's how Kyrie Irving's 2016 role could be replicated alongside Luka Doncic. You could give a breakdown of the most effective actions that Kyrie ran in 2016. You can talk about ways that Luka can be better off the ball. You can talk about what defensive scheme to play with these two that'll help minimize the damage they do by being bad defenders. And what kind of personnel Dallas needs to go after to play that way. But in reality, that's not going to get clicks. So if you go to your boss can be like, no, don't write about that. You know what you've got to write about? Was Kyrie invited to Luka's wedding? And so that's why we get all the trash stories that we do. If you don't get the clicks, then there's layoffs. The Athletic does a lot of the best sports journalism in the business, but they had to lay off a bunch of people. All these companies laid off a bunch of writers. SB Nation laid off Caitlin Cooper, maybe the best basketball writer in the world, a writer so smart that Tyrese Halliburton, a basketball genius, says he even learns things about basketball from reading her pieces. Why did they let her go? Because she covers the intricacies of Pacers basketball and not Taco Tuesday. Who do we start? Who do we bench? Who do we cut? Which one of these guys should take the last shot? And so all the real basketball discussion is being pushed out of the online basketball world. And so people who love capitalism.
There's a very, very similar thing that's happened in political journalism where investigative journalists like Seymour Hersh, unless you're a legend like Seymour Hersh who's already financially stable, you won't get hired, right? Especially these stupid outlets like the Daily Mail and BuzzFeed and the Daily Beast, like they just want fluff pieces. They want you to pump out fluff pieces. They don't want you to take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months on a unique story that requires you to actually do investigative journalism, because they're just trying to make as much money as possible by throwing as much shit at the wall as they possibly can. So there's a crisis in this country where we have less and less investigative journalists, and corporate outlets are hiring less and less investigative journalists. And it's not just at like BuzzFeed and the Daily Beast. It's even at the New York Times, the Washington Post, right? They want quantity over quality a lot of the times.
They'll be like, no, capitalism is great. It drives innovation. People will be so scared of going homeless and going without healthcare that it'll drive them to write the best possible basketball article ever, the best possible basketball video ever. And that sounds good in theory, I guess, if you're like a caveman alpha type guy. Everything has to be life or death. But guess what, guys? We live under capitalism.
Sounds good in theory if you're a middle schooler who's never actually experienced capitalism or has never actually had to struggle to put food on the table.
And this is the result. Capitalism hates basketball and it loves Taco Tuesday. So if you're somebody who's angry about the state of basketball coverage, direct it towards capitalism.
I agree. Good video, sir. Shout out to that guy. That was an interesting video. So yeah, that's our sports coverage for today. And you see how sports journalism, watching that video about sports journalism, there were all these parallels that I was able to draw with political journalism, because it's a lot of the same phenomena, right? Capitalism has these laws of motion that affect every industry or every sphere of society. Sam says, search DOD marketing contracts. The NFL has changed. This is wild. I had no idea about this. And Sam, we can talk about this briefly, but I want to do a whole segment on this now that you brought it to my attention, because this is wild. This is exactly what I was talking about with the Super Bowl basically being an advertisement for the U.S. military. So I guess the military paid pro sports teams $10.4 million for patriotic displays and tributes to the troops. The McCain-Flake report finds $53 million in Department of Defense spending on patriotic displays at sporting events. So I didn't even know about this when I said that at the Super Bowl they were flying military jets over the stadium, and one of the coaches was crying at the national anthem as Chris Stapleton was singing it. I actually really like Chris Stapleton's music, but still it was like, wow, this is just a big display of propaganda for the U.S. military. This dude's literally crying as he watches U.S. jets fly over the sky, the same jets that drop bombs on children in Iraq in that illegal and unjustified intervention that killed millions and created ISIS. He's crying. He's crying at how good those jets are. I'm not surprised that Secret Base made this. Secret Base is one of my favorite sports accounts. They're pretty based when it comes to politics, and they do some of the best sports videos I've ever seen. Make sure to follow Secret Base on YouTube if you haven't already. But yeah, I want to cover this. I mean, I guess we could just watch this video now. I want to check this. Thank you so much, Duck Hash Browns, for the $5 super chat. Appreciate you, and appreciate you for being a YouTube member, my friend. By the way, YouTube members get access to a bunch of emotes and a bunch of cool privileges. You get access to the Midwestern Marks Discord. So if you're a YouTube member, make sure you join the Discord. And $10 YouTube members get access to Carlos's book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. So please, if you're a YouTube member, make sure to take advantage of all the perks that we offer you. I'd love to have more people in the Discord learning Marxism and interacting and engaging. But Duck Hash Brown says, I am deep into basketball coverage, and the guys who are just who are the best just run Patreon accounts because they can't do deep dives on major outlets. Exactly. That's so true. That's the same with football in a lot of ways. Wrestling's different because wrestling's not a mainstream sport in the first place. So it's hard for anyone to make money doing wrestling journalism. But I would say these guys, Secret Base, I mean, I think they're connected to SB Nation technically, so they are connected to a big journalistic outlet, I guess, but they're one of my favorites, and they just publish like YouTube videos. So that's super interesting that a lot of the best investigative journalists in basketball have to do Patreon, because think about it in political journalism. I mean, it's even worse in political journalism. All of the good journalists I know are independent. Every single one of them. Well, 99.9% of the good journalists I know are independent. Because in order to get a job with one of the mainstream outlets, in order to get a job with the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, Fox News, you have to be an insufferable liar. You have to be an insufferable simp to the political establishment, to the economic ruling class. So it's gotten to the point where literally every journalist who tells the truth at all is independently funded. And then they have to find a way to boost their content and get people to read their content without having it blasted over the media by all these propaganda outlets, by all the established outlets. So again, total parallel there between sports journalism and political journalism, which is one of the reasons I think a segment about sports every day would be interesting. But thank you, Duck Hash Browns, for that. Midwestern Mark's annual kickball game. I'm so down. My legs are huge and I have a cannon. There's not many things that I was good at besides wrestling when it comes to sports. Like, I'm not super fast. I have decent balance, but I can boot the shit out of a kickball. So I'm down. Thank you so much for the $2 super chat, Sebastian. And Sebastian also sent a lot of these videos that we're reacting to today. So thank you for that. And you too can have me react to your videos if you join the Discord.
If you've been to a sporting event, then chances are you've seen a salute to service where the home team brings out a couple service members, the crowd applauds, and then goes back to booing A-Rod. The moment is a nice patriotic...
Sorry, Secret Base is Chapo adjacent flaccid leftoids, though, not MLs. Yeah, I mean, at this point in America, almost nobody's going to be a Marxist-Leninist, right? That's why it was shocking when Second Thought turned out to be a Marxist-Leninist. Like, it's very, 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 very rare to be a Marxist-Leninist still. We're growing. We're building. Marxism is finally taking root in the United States. But most popular people who lean left, like, I'll give them a pat on the back if they're pro-labor. Like Secret Base or John Boys, especially, who's my favorite football content creator, JONBOIS. He's done all these pro-union videos and videos in favor of the football players going on strike and getting paid more, right? And he's not explicitly Marxist-Leninist, but he's pro-labor, right? So in this neoliberal capitalist society that we live in, you got to take what you can get. If somebody's pro-labor, that's good. We can turn more people into MLs as we go.
Gesture by the team, assuming, of course...
Yeah, I don't like Chapo Trap House either, but...
that it is a gesture and not the result of an advertising contract. Over the last several months, Senators John McCain and Jeff Flake conducted an investigation of Department of Defense spending and found that DOD have paid pro sports teams $10.5 million since 2012, $6.8 million of which went towards paid patriotism, an array of tributes, including on-field color guards. Are you kidding me? Paying money to put a color guard on the field? Trust me, there is not a lot of competition in the color guard industry. Who's gonna swoop in and steal that action? The Boy Scouts? Paid patriotism first made headlines this spring when NJ.com found, among other things, that the Jets accepted money from the National Guard to honor service members on the Jumbotron. On the day that the NFL draft began, Flake posted on his website, "This will probably stand as the biggest draft day bust for the Jets until 8 p.m. Oh, Senator Jeff Flake? More like Senator Hot Take. And while I respect a solid Jets burn, let the record show that Leonard Williams is the real deal. Of course, you can't object to paid patriotism without seen it all real talk from internet commenters. Meh, ads aren't free. Oh no, Thanks for clearing that up, Professor Capitalism. This is my first day on your planet and your alien ways confuse me. And then there's this one. Do the networks offer free time for the military's commercials? Isn't paid sports patriotism the same thing? No, it's not the same thing. And here's why. If I went to the zoo and saw a polar bear open a bottle of soda, I would lose my mind. I would elbow children out of the way to record that shit on my iPhone and make bank on that YouTube. But when the polar bear drinks soda on my TV, I don't applaud for the Coke commercial. That's the difference. Advertising is okay. Sponsored segments are fine. But don't reunite a service member with his family on the field and collect a check for it. That's shitty. And that's why McCain and Flake are going to pass legislation banning it.
All the military advertising is bad. All capitalism is bad. But yeah, this is crazy. $53 million from the Department of Defense. Makes me sad. The last wrestling tournament I was at, I posted a TikTok about this. There was literally a banner on the wall that said, like, brought to you by Raytheon. I'm like, oh, is it now? My wrestling is brought to you by Raytheon. They haven't paid me anything, but I'm glad they're sponsoring this tournament. I got one more video to react to today. I also had one on Gaddafi's spokesperson on the collapse of the Libyan government, but we'll watch that next time. I just wanted to, I don't have much commentary on this. I just thought it was really good. This is Wyatt Reed of the Gray Zone, friend of Midwestern Mark, somebody who spent a lot of time in the Donbass region, reporting on what's going on in Ukraine, what's actually going on in Ukraine. Works for the Gray Zone. I was talking earlier about independent journalists and how great they are and how all the good journalists in the modern day have to fund themselves through Patreon or fund themselves independently. So the Gray Zone guys are no different. They're a perfect example of that. Wyatt Reed is a perfect example of that. A real journalist, someone who's actually doing investigative reporting, someone who's not bought and paid for by the political establishment, and therefore someone who could never get a job with MSNBC, CNN, or any of the mainstream outlets because they won't give you a job if you tell the truth, which is what the books Manufacturing Consent and Inventing Reality are about. The way that truth tellers are systematically ousted from or prevented from entering the mainstream media establishment. So I really like Wyatt Reed, and this was his take on rich men north of Richmond. I know he's from Appalachia, from sort of the same area as where a lot of this country music and folk music comes from. So here's his defense of the song.
A right-wing
I wish I could make this full screen.
Plant that he was somehow, that he didn't even write the song, that it was like some big right-wing production that was written for him and filmed for him, and it was artificially boosted through. But really what they're basically admitting to when they come up with these insane theories is like, we can't wrap our heads around somebody other than us producing some cultural item that actually has mass appeal, right? So there has to be some nefarious explanation for why people are gravitating to this song. That literally the main message, I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay. That's what people gravitate towards. And there's like this, it's just the dots do not connect. It's something there is not clicking, that they're somehow unable to comprehend this as, a genuine or organic reflection of what people are going through in, quote unquote.
And I have inside information because I've been emailing back and forth with Oliver Anthony, but he's literally a factory worker, you guys. He is literally a factory worker, and people want to say this isn't a real expression of working class sentiment. He literally said, we can do the interview whenever I get off work. It should be around 6 p.m. Like, he's scheduling his interview around his work at the factory. So what do you mean this isn't a real expression of the working class? It's a working class guy singing a song about his everyday life. What more do you need? Yeah, so what? Some right-wingers boosted it, right? Some right-wingers took the song and marketed it. Oh, well, thanks for the free advertising, Dan Bongino. Let's keep organizing class struggle. Please boost Midwestern Marx, Dan Bongino. I don't care if the leftists call us astroturfed. As long as our message, as long as our educational content reaches more people.
Quote, flyover country. And I'll just, I happen to be from one of these no good, desolate backwaters in Appalachia. Tiny town called Elliston, Virginia, population 2,000 is where I grew up. A town that has been decimated, a town that has been destroyed, like basically every other small town in Appalachia, from the opiate epidemic to offshoring. There's just, these towns have been systematically deprived of any employment prospects, and then the survivors got wiped out with this manufactured drug epidemic. So people who are listening to these songs, they like want something, they need something to believe in.
And that I listen to music like this. All right, there's a song I really like called Broken Window Serenade. That's about all the drugs that flowed into these places in Appalachia and the Deep South after the jobs were outsourced by Bill Clinton, which is why a lot of these people voted for Trump, because they knew that Clinton had outsourced their jobs and allowed the opioid epidemic to happen. They didn't want another Clinton in power. This is the kind of music I listen to. Zach Bryan, Tyler Childers, Sturgill Simpson. And then to just get attacked by a bunch of leftists for enjoying the working class music that I enjoy, it was like, what the hell? No wonder working class people don't want to join the left. No wonder factory workers in Appalachia don't want to join the left. Or working class people in the Midwest. You guys treat them like shit. You guys hate them for enjoying the music that they enjoy. You call them fascists for enjoying the music that they like. These wokes act as gatekeepers to the left. They act as gatekeepers to a real movement based on unifying people, based on their position in the economy. They're against unifying people based on the fact that they're working class. They gatekeep a real movement based on class struggle from working class people. It's a bunch of like liberal college students and shit.
Right. And instead, what they get from the media is emptiness, bullshit. The mainstream media, actually, there was this big current in media reports about the opioid epidemic, where a lot of these magazines, publications were basically blaming people here for it. And then there was this big current about because the MSM ignored the CIA-sponsored crack epidemic in black neighborhoods, that this is like the just comeuppance that people here deserve to have this happen to us now. But the reality is, like, people in Appalachia didn't do that. They did, right? The elites, the political elites, and their media representatives. And in Appalachia, we have a very long tradition of just keeping to ourselves, and that goes beyond way before the Prohibition days, and that extends to the people of all races who have made their homes here. And now finally there's a song that speaks to that reality, to the unbearable kind of desolation that people have been going through, that the pain that translates into the increasing rates of social isolation, drug overdoses, suicides. People here are suffering, and that's what the song is about. And that's why it resonates so much. And it's incredible to watch all these like rad libs who've never worked a real job in their life, who've never seen the reality of one of these forgotten towns. They suddenly crawl out of the woodwork to condemn this guy, and by extension, everybody else who relates to it. And, you know, I don't know, we're talking about one of the most downtrodden communities and regions in this country. And if people aren't able to relate to that, I think they should ask themselves why that is. Because there's just something about.
Thank you so much, Sam, for the super chat. And exactly, this is something Carlos talks about in the Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, that the left doesn't want the left to be a popular movement. They don't want more workers to be Marxists, right? Because they don't view Marxism as the real movement of history. They don't view communism as the real movement of history, right? They it's not their goal to organize class struggle so that we can move forward out of capitalism. It's not their goal to organize a mass movement based on people's class position, right? They just view being a Marxist as some countercultural identity that they have, right? I'm a Marxist to rebel against my parents or whatever. I'm a Marxist to rebel against whatever, my teachers. I'm a Marxist. They see it as some sort of identity label that makes them special or makes them unique, right? They don't view Marxism as a science that looks at how societies change, how we actually improve society, how we actually improve people's material conditions, which, you know, is what Marxism is. It's the science of class struggle. It's understanding that societies and modes of production change based on struggles between concrete economic classes. And we need to, it's our goal to organize the working class, the class of wage laborers, which Oliver Anthony is one of those wage laborers, and he's singing a song about the plight of wage laborers in this country. So to completely dismiss it when it gets 27 million views in like a week is insanity for anybody who calls themselves a Marxist. But these people don't want to make Marxism popular. These leftists don't. They want to be unique and special and, you know, have Marxism be a part of their unique identity. Thank you so much, Sam. Couldn't agree more.
This American culture now, it's a culture of death. It's a culture of despair. That's what makes the song appealing, is it is presenting an alternative. And you read through the comments on this video, and people aren't talking about, you know, oh, the Jews and the blacks did this to us. They're talking about being fed up with a system that tells them to play by the rules, milks them dry their whole life, and leaves them with nothing to show for it. And they're talking about the joy and the relief that comes with knowing that other people are going through this too, and that they're not alone. So I don't know. It's just, I never saw this as speaking against people. It's just, to me, it's like, you know, the people who are enjoying this song, they just want you to relate to. That was all they wanted. And if you can't, sorry. But in the meantime, people are dying. And this is not some theoretical exercise that you just type away. You know, so on behalf of Appalachia, I just want to say, like, get with it or get lost.
Get with it or get lost. I love it. I love it. They are faux Marxists adopting Marxism as a designer identity status symbol. All fake. Couldn't agree more, Lavender Rose. Could not agree more. That's why it's so important to read theory and educate yourself and actually understand what Marxism is before you call yourself a Marxist. Che Guevara had this idea that you're forged in the struggle, right? That there's a process of becoming a communist. You don't just call yourself a communist. You don't just label yourself a communist as some sort of identity status symbol, right? But you become a communist through reading theory, through engaging in struggle, through talking with your comrades, because that helps you understand what Marxism is. It helps you understand the class struggle. It helps you understand the proletariat and the working class of your country. And you only gain that experience and you only develop that way through practice, through engaging in organizing, or through reading Marxist theory. And the more you read, the more you engage in organizing, the more communist you become, the more resolute in your ideas you become, the more you understand Marxism, the more you understand your own country and the working class of your own country. But a lot of these terminally online Marxists just see it as an identity status symbol. They don't read theory, they don't engage in practice, and they don't develop as communists at all. And then when something like this song comes along that is an opportunity to organize a bunch of the American working class, they dismiss it as evil. And, you know, they hate that more and more people are becoming communists because it makes their identity label less unique. So, yeah. Well, that's all I got for today, y'all. I appreciate everybody who sat through this stream with us. Appreciate everybody who sent in videos to the Discord. Appreciate everybody who sent super chats. Appreciate our moderators like Ware Pilgrim and Cobra Commander. We'll be back later with another stream, either today or tomorrow. I'll probably be on with Carlos. Patreon.com/MidwesternMarks. Become a YouTube member. Become a Twitch subscriber. Follow our Twitch for a gaming stream, like 3 gaming streams a week. You can also follow Eddie Ligersmith Gaming on YouTube. We just released a new book from Dr. Thomas Riggins, which you can get at MidwesternMarks.com in the store section. So check that out. It's on philosophy. Got a new book coming out soon from Giannis Iqbal that I'm really excited about, that focuses on capitalist/neoliberal education versus socialist education. And yeah, solidarity forever.
And economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.